The wind came first, a low moan across the plains that tasted of grit and distance. It scoured the main street of Silver Creek, Arizona, peeling paint from false fronts and whipping dust into blinding ochre-colored devils. Catherine Morgan, lately of Boston, hunched her shoulders against the onslaught, her threadbare dress offering little protection. Her world had shrunk to the gnawing emptiness in her stomach and the smooth, cool weight of the silver locket in her palm. Inside lay the last friendly face she knew on earth, a miniature portrait of her mother, serene and smiling. It was all she had left. The year was 1876, and the promises of the West had proven to be as insubstantial as the dust swirling around her ankles. The teaching position she had traveled 500 agonizing miles to claim had vanished, filled by a local girl weeks before her arrival. For 3 days she had survived on pride and the dwindling hope that anything would turn up. Now both were gone. Suddenly, a gunshot cracked through the rising howl of the wind, sharp and ugly. A woman screamed. The double doors of the Silver Creek Bank burst open, spilling 2 masked men into the maelstrom. They moved with a brutal efficiency, canvas sacks slung over their shoulders, pistols held low. Panic erupted. Townsfolk scattered like quail, diving for cover behind water troughs and overturned barrels. Catherine froze, a deer caught in the glare of an oncoming train. The chaos was a physical thing, a wave of bodies and fear that slammed into her. One of the robbers, a burly figure whose eyes were cold slits above his bandana, veered directly toward her. She tried to move, but her limbs were leaden, her mind numb with hunger and shock. He collided with her, not by accident, but with a deliberate, jarring force. His gloved hand shot out not for money, but for the one thing she held dear. He ripped the locket from her grasp, the delicate chain snapping against her skin. For a heartbeat their eyes met. She saw no greed in his, only a cold, calculated cruelty. Then he was gone, swallowed by the swirling dust as he and his partner swung onto their waiting horses and thundered out of town. The loss was a physical blow more devastating than any hunger pang. It was the severing of her last tie to the person she used to be. The ground, already unsteady, rushed up to meet her. The world didn't fade to black. It shattered into a million pieces of swirling dust and despair. As consciousness fled, the last thing she registered was the sound of approaching hoofbeats, a stark counterpoint to the fading thunder of the robber's escape. Zachary Hayes reined in his buckskin, the horse skittish from the gunfire and the storm. He'd been riding into town for supplies when the robbery exploded from the bank. Through the thick curtain of dust, he saw the bandits flee, and the slender woman in the faded blue dress crumple to the ground. He was off his horse before the thought to dismount fully formed his mind, wired for action by years of surviving in a land that offered no second chances. "Stand back. Give her air," Zach's voice cut through the nervous chatter of the small crowd that was beginning to emerge from hiding. He knelt, his worn leather chaps sinking into the thick dust. Her face was alabaster pale beneath the grime, her cheekbones too sharp, her lips cracked and bloodless. He saw the faint red line on her neck where the chain had been broken. He had seen the robbery, the casual brutality of the theft. It was the small, cruel details that always stuck with him. "Someone get Doc Miller," he commanded, sliding his arms beneath her slight frame. She weighed next to nothing. He'd held wounded men during the war who felt heavier. This was a different kind of wound, the slow erosion of starvation. "Ain't no need for a doctor." Zach grunted, Tom Holloway, the general store owner, wiping dust from his spectacles. "That girl's just hungry. Been watching her for 2 days, staring at the bread in my window like it was the crown jewels." Zach's jaw tightened. He knew the bite of hunger, the way it hollowed you out from the inside until you were nothing but a shell. He'd come west from Tennessee with nothing but the clothes on his back and memories he'd rather forget, and he'd never lost the taste of that desperation. "Then I'll buy her some food. Tom, get a basket ready. Bread, cheese, whatever you've got. I'm taking her to the hotel." Mrs. Peterson, the formidable proprietress of the Silver Creek Hotel, initially balked at the idea of giving a room to an unconscious, penniless stranger. But Zach Hayes was not a man to be argued with, and the $3 silver he slapped on her front desk spoke a language she understood perfectly. He carried Catherine upstairs, laid her gently on the bed, and removed her scuffed shoes. He worked with a practiced gentleness, loosening the tight collar of her dress to help her breathe. By the time Tom Holloway arrived with a basket of provisions, Zach had a basin of water and was dabbing the grime from her face with a clean cloth. "Put it on my account," Zach said, his voice low, "and have your wife send over some broth when it's ready." When Catherine's eyelids fluttered open, the first thing she saw was the rough-hewn timber of an unfamiliar ceiling. The scent of soap and fresh bread replaced the memory of dust and gunpowder. A deep voice startled her. "You're awake." She turned her head. A man sat in a chair by the bed, a silhouette against the dusty light filtering through the window. He was tall, even seated, with shoulders that strained the fabric of his shirt. As her vision cleared, she recognized the concerned blue eyes from that final moment before she collapsed. "Where am I?" Her voice was a dry, rasping whisper. "Silver Creek Hotel. You fainted." He leaned forward, offering a glass of water. "Drink slowly." Memory returned in a painful rush: the robbery, the locket, the brutal theft. A wave of mortification washed over her. The bank, a man. He took, "I know," he said, his voice calm and steady, a rock in her sea of confusion. "He took your locket. I saw it happen." He didn't offer platitudes or false hope. He stated it as a fact, acknowledging her loss without minimizing it. "There's food here. Best to start slow." The mention of food made her stomach clench with a pain that was almost unbearable. Pride, a luxury she could no longer afford, warred with the primal scream of her body's needs. "I cannot accept charity, sir. It's not charity, it's bread." He interrupted, a note of finality in his tone that brooked no argument. "My name is Zachary Hayes. Folks call me Zach." She finally gave in, her dignity collapsing under the weight of his simple, undeniable kindness. "Catherine Morgan," she managed. He retrieved the basket and set it on the bed beside her. The smell of the freshly baked loaf was intoxicating. The first bite was a revelation so intensely good, it brought tears to her eyes. She forced herself to eat slowly, to chew, to savor, though every instinct shrieked at her to devour it all in seconds. Zach, seeing her struggle, tactfully turned to look out the window, granting her a small measure of privacy. "You're not from around here?" He observed, his back still to her. "Boston," she confirmed between careful bites. "My parents, they passed. I came for a teaching position, and the position was gone." He finished for her. It wasn't a question. He'd seen it before. The West was littered with broken promises. He turned back as she finished a piece of bread and cheese, a little color returning to her cheeks. The men who robbed the bank, they were after more than just money. Stealing that locket, that was personal. Catherine looked up, surprised. "I don't know anyone here. It had to be random." "Nothing's ever random in a town this small," he said, his blue eyes holding a deep, assessing look. "You rest. The room is paid through tomorrow. We'll figure something out." He placed his hat on his head, and the brim curled from years of sun and rain. At the door, he paused. "Silver Creek's a growing town, Miss Morgan. Might just have a place for you yet." After he left, Catherine sank back against the pillows, her body aching with exhaustion, but her mind racing. Zachary Hayes wasn't just a kind stranger. He was something else entirely. He had seen her at her absolute lowest, and instead of pity, he had offered her sustenance and respect. And in his words, she heard the first faint echo of something she thought she had lost forever, a reason to fight. The next morning, Zach found Catherine downstairs speaking with Mrs. Peterson. She stood taller than she had the day before, the hollows in her cheeks less pronounced, a flicker of her Boston-bred determination returning to her eyes. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice clear and formal, "I wish to thank you again for your assistance. I have inquired with Mrs. Peterson, and she believes the Richardson family may have need of a tutor and housekeeper." "The Richardsons?" Zach nodded. "Good family. Made their money in silver. They've got 3 young ones who could use some book learning." He looked her over, noting the careful way she'd mended a tear in her cuff. "It's hard work." "I am no stranger to hard work, Mr. Hayes," she replied, a spark of defiance in her tone. A corner of his mouth twitched. "I can see that." He turned to Mrs. Peterson. "See that she gets a decent wage, Martha. She's worth more than you think." By midday, Catherine was installed in a small but clean room in the Richardson house, a sprawling mansion at the edge of town that was a testament to new money. The work was, as Zach had predicted, relentless. Margaret Richardson was a woman perpetually overwhelmed by her own fortune, and her 3 children were energetic and largely undisciplined. Yet Catherine found a strange comfort in the routine and the exhaustion that came from honest labor. She was earning her keep. She was surviving. 2 weeks later, as she walked the children through town, a man on a fine black stallion tipped his hat to her. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his smile disarmingly charming, his eyes a startlingly pale gray. "Miss Morgan." "I presume," he said, his voice smooth and educated. Catherine, surprised to be addressed by a stranger, nodded cautiously. "I am. My name is Silas Blackwood. I am new to Silver Creek, but I've already heard of the capable woman from the East who has tamed the Richardson children." He laughed, a pleasant, cultured sound. "I simply wanted to introduce myself. It is always a pleasure to meet a fellow civilized soul in these rustic environs." He was handsome, charismatic, and everything about him screamed wealth and influence. He was also, Catherine felt, with a sudden, inexplicable chill, watching her with an intensity that felt less like admiration and more like assessment. That evening, the name Blackwood came up at the Richardsons' dinner table. "He's buying up land like there's no tomorrow," Mr. Richardson said, swirling the brandy in his glass. "Bought the old Miller place, the Jackson parcel. Word is, he's trying to get his hands on all the land bordering the creek. Controls the water, controls everything. He seems quite the gentleman," Mrs. Richardson sighed. "So refined." Catherine said nothing, but the unsettling feeling from their brief encounter lingered. A few days later, Zach rode into town. He found Catherine in the general store, and the simple, steady sight of him was a balm to her frayed nerves. "Miss Morgan," he greeted her with a nod. "Mr. Hayes," she replied, a small, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time in days. "I hope you are well." "Well enough. Heard you settled in with the Richardsons." His gaze was direct, searching. "They treating you right?" "They are." She hesitated, then decided to voice her unease. "Have you met a Mr. Silas Blackwood?" Zach's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. The warmth in his eyes cooled to a flat, watchful blue. "He paid me a visit. Made an offer on my ranch." The Double H. Catherine was surprised. From what she'd heard, it was one of the most successful spreads in the territory. "He offered twice what it's worth." Zach said, his voice low and tight. "When I told him it wasn't for sale, he smiled." Zach paused, as if searching for the right word. It wasn't a friendly smile. He said, "Every man has a price, and some men have debts that must be paid one way or another." Zach's hand unconsciously drifted to his side, near the worn grip of his Colt. "He mentioned he knew I served in the war. Said he had a special interest in men from Tennessee." The veiled threat was unmistakable. This wasn't just about land or water. As Zach spoke, Catherine felt a cold dread crystallize in her chest. Silas Blackwood's arrival in Silver Creek was not a coincidence, nor was the theft of her locket. She and Zach were pieces in a game whose rules they didn't understand, a game that had begun long before she ever collapsed in the dust of this town. She looked at Zach, at the grim set of his jaw and the haunted look that had flickered in his eyes, and knew that his refusal to sell the Double H was not the end of the matter. It was the beginning of a war. The war began not with a bang, but with the quiet turning of a screw. A week after Zach's refusal, one of his ranch hands found the north fence line cut 100 head of prime cattle scattered across the open range. It took Zach and his men 3 grueling days under the blinding glare of the Arizona sun to round them up. Then the water in one of his primary wells turned brackish, tainted with lye. He was forced to move his herd miles south, losing valuable grazing time. In town, whispers started. They were insidious, like smoke seeping under a door. People said Zach Hayes was losing his touch, that the Double H was struggling. Silas Blackwood, meanwhile, hosted a lavish party for the town's influential citizens, donating a generous sum to the church-building fund and charming everyone with his wit and Eastern manners. He never mentioned Zach's name, but he didn't have to. The contrast was clear: the polished, successful newcomer versus the struggling, solitary rancher. Catherine saw the toll it was taking on Zach during his infrequent visits to town. New lines of strain were etched around his eyes. He was quieter, his natural reticence deepening into a grim watchfulness. Yet when he looked at her, the concern in his gaze was for her safety, not his own. "You should be careful," he told her one Sunday as they shared a brief, stolen moment away from the prying eyes of the Richardsons. "Blackwood, he's not just a businessman. There's something wrong about him." "I know," she said, her voice low. "His men. One of them, a man with a jagged scar on his left cheek. I've seen him watching the Richardson house." Zach went still. "Describe him." "Big, broad-shouldered. He walks with a slight limp." Zach's jaw clenched. "That's Jedediah Kane. Rode with Quantrill's raiders during the war. A killer. He was one of the men who came to my ranch with Blackwood, and he was the man who had stolen her locket." The memory of his cold eyes, the deliberate cruelty of the act, clicked into place. It was him, Zach. He was one of the bank robbers. The confirmation hung in the air between them, heavy and dangerous. This was a coordinated campaign. The robbery, the theft of the locket, the sabotage at the ranch, they were all connected, all orchestrated by Silas Blackwood. "He's trying to isolate me," Zach said, thinking aloud. "Ruin my reputation, break me financially. He wants me desperate." Why Catherine asked the question that had tormented her for weeks. Why this elaborate, cruel game? "I don't know," Zach admitted, but his eyes held a shadow of a memory, a darkness he wouldn't let her see. "But we're going to find out." That conversation was a turning point. Catherine realized she could not be a passive observer. Zach was fighting a ghost from his past, and she was inexplicably tied to it. Her sharp mind, her education. The very things that made her an outsider in this rough-hewn world were the only weapons she possessed. She began to listen more carefully to the gossip at the Richardsons' dinner table, to parse the conversations in the general store. Zach, in turn, began to rely on her. One evening, he brought her a stack of legal documents related to his land deeds and water rights. "I can read them," he said, a touch of frustration in his voice. "But the language, it's meant to confuse a plain man." They sat together in the Richardsons' quiet library long after the family had gone to bed. Under the soft glow of an oil lamp, Catherine's clear voice translated the dense legalese into simple terms, identifying potential loopholes and clauses Blackwood might try to exploit. As she worked, Zach watched her, his expression a mixture of admiration and something deeper, something more vulnerable. He saw not just an educated woman, but a partner, a strategist, whose intellect was as formidable as his own strength. Their bond, forged in crisis, deepened into something that resembled the quiet, steady rhythm of teamwork. He taught her to shoot, taking her to a secluded canyon on the edge of his property. He placed a small light pistol in her hand, his own large hands guiding hers, showing her how to stand, how to aim, how to control her breathing. "It's not a toy," he said, his voice serious, echoing the words he'd once spoken to the Richardson boy. "It's a tool. I hope to God you never have to use it, but I won't have you be defenseless." She was a natural, her focus intense, her hand steady. The act of learning to defend herself was empowering. It was a declaration that she would not be a victim again. As the days shortened and the nights grew cooler, their shared struggle wove their lives together. The quiet moments in the library, the shared tension of a rifle lesson, the brief understanding glances exchanged in town, and these became the foundation of a trust more profound than any whispered sweet nothings. They were soldiers in a silent war, and in the heart of that danger, they were beginning to fall in love. Catherine's investigation began in the musty archives of the Silver Creek Courthouse. She told the Richardsons she was researching a history of the region for the children's lessons, a plausible excuse that granted her access to stacks of town records, property deeds, and back issues of the territorial newspaper. The county clerk, a balding man named Abernathy, was happy to have the company. She started with Silas Blackwood's land purchases. They were all meticulously legal, paid for in cash with drafts from a San Francisco bank. There were no clues there. So she shifted her focus to Blackwood himself. He had arrived claiming to be a wealthy investor from Philadelphia looking for new opportunities. Catherine spent days poring over old passenger manifests for stagecoach lines and railroads. No Silas Blackwood from Philadelphia had purchased a ticket west in the preceding year. It was a small inconsistency, but it was a loose thread. She pulled on it. While Catherine delved into the past, Zach fought a battle in the present. The sabotage escalated. A fire, small and quickly contained, broke out in his main barn. A prize bull went missing, only to be found dead at the bottom of a ravine, its legs broken. His men were getting spooked. The rumors in town were getting worse. He was becoming an island. His nights were plagued by nightmares, fragmented images of smoke, fire, and the sound of a woman screaming a name. He would wake up in a cold sweat, the scent of burning pine sharp in his memory, his heart hammering against his ribs. The war was a place he never revisited in his waking hours, a locked room in his mind. But Silas Blackwood had found the key and was forcing the door open, letting the ghosts spill out. He grew more withdrawn, and the haunted look in his eyes becoming a permanent fixture. He knew Catherine saw it, felt her worried gaze on him when he thought she wasn't looking. But how could he explain a past he had spent more than a decade trying to bury? How could he tell this gentle, intelligent woman about the things a desperate young man does to survive a war? One afternoon, Catherine found what she was looking for. Tucked into the society pages of a months-old newspaper from Prescott was a brief article about a charity ball. It mentioned the attendance of several prominent territorial figures, including the recently arrived investor, Mr. Silas Blackwood, who spoke eloquently of his family's shipping interests in Baltimore. Baltimore, not Philadelphia. It was more than a simple lie. It was a deliberate misdirection. A man with nothing to hide did not change the details of his life from one town to the next. Armed with this new piece of information, Catherine wrote a letter to a former colleague of her father's, a history professor at a Baltimore university, asking him to search for any records of a prominent Blackwood family involved in shipping. It was a long shot, a message in a bottle cast into an ocean of uncertainty. But it was all she had. Weeks passed. The first chill of autumn settled over the high desert. The letter from Baltimore arrived on a day when the sky was a bright, aching blue. Catherine's hands trembled as she opened it. The professor's reply was concise. There had never been a Blackwood family in the Baltimore shipping trade. However, the name had triggered a memory. He had enclosed a copy of a newspaper article from 1864, a small, tragic story from a rural county in Tennessee. The article described a brutal Civil War incident. A Union patrol led by a young lieutenant had been tracking a band of Confederate guerrillas known for raiding supply lines. Acting on flawed intelligence, the patrol had surrounded a remote farmhouse believed to be the guerrillas' hideout. They had set fire to the barn to flush them out. But the guerrillas weren't there. The fire had spread to the house, trapping the family inside. The farmer, his wife, and their young daughter had perished. Only their teenage son, who had been out hunting, survived. He had returned to find his home in ashes and his family gone. Catherine's blood ran cold as she read the last line. The name of the family who had died in the fire was Redfield. The name of the Union lieutenant who had given the order was Zachary Hayes. That evening, she rode out to the Double H, the newspaper clipping clutched in her hand. She found Zach in the barn, mending a saddle, his face grim in the lantern light. He looked up as she entered, his expression softening for a moment before he saw the look on her face. "Catherine, what is it? What's wrong?" She couldn't speak. She simply handed him the clipping. He took it, his brow furrowed in confusion. He read it slowly, his face draining of all color, becoming a pale, taut mask. The saddle knife fell from his hand, clattering on the wooden floor. "Where did you get this?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Silas Blackwood is not his real name," she said, her own voice shaking. "His mother's maiden name was Blackwood. His real name is Silas Redfield." Zach staggered back, as if she had struck him, his hand coming up to brace himself against a post. The ghosts he had been fighting were no longer in his nightmares. They were here in his barn, standing between him and the woman he loved. "We were boys," he said, his voice ragged with a grief more than a decade old. "Just boys playing soldier. We were told they were killers, that they'd slaughtered a dozen of our men the week before. The intelligence said they were in that house." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a desperate need for her to understand. "I gave the order. The fire, it got out of control so fast. We heard them screaming. By the time we realized our mistake, it was too late." He sank onto a hay bale, burying his face in his hands. "I've lived with it every day since. Every single day." A shadow fell across the barn door. "And now you will die with it." They both looked up. Silas Blackwood stood there, silhouetted against the dying light. The charming facade was gone, stripped away, to reveal a face contorted by a cold, pure hatred. In his hand, he held a faded, dog-eared photograph. "This was my family, Hayes." He hissed, his voice trembling with rage. "My mother, my father, my little sister. You burned them alive. You stood there and listened to them scream." He took a step into the barn, his pale gray eyes locking onto Zach. "For 12 years I have thought of nothing else. I rebuilt myself. I made a fortune, all for this moment. I don't want your land. I want your life. I want to strip away everything you care about, just as you stripped away everything I ever loved. And I decided to start," he said, his gaze shifting to Catherine with chilling malice, with her. The frame was set with chilling precision. The body of Jedediah Kane, the man with the scar, was found in a gully on Double H land. He had been shot in the back. The pistol lying beside him was a model known to be favored by Zach. The sheriff, a decent but unimaginative man named Elias Thorne, arrived with a posse. "Zach, I don't want to believe it." Thorne set, his face a mask of weary duty. "But Kane was one of Blackwood's men. There's bad blood between you. And this looks bad." "It's a setup, Elias," Zach said, his voice low and steady, though his mind was racing. "Blackwood killed him to frame me." "Maybe," the sheriff conceded. "But I have to take you in. It's the law." Zach knew what would happen. Blackwood owned the judge. He'd be tried, convicted, and hanged before the first snow fell. He had only one choice. While Thorne was speaking to his deputies, Zach moved. It wasn't a panicked flight, but a calculated explosion of motion. He vaulted over a fence, whistled sharply for his horse, and was gone in a spray of dirt and thunder of hooves before the posse could even draw their weapons. He was now a fugitive, a wanted man in the territory he had helped build. Silver Creek turned on him overnight. Silas Blackwood played the part of the grieving employer to perfection, offering a substantial reward for Zach's capture. He painted Zach as a violent man, a killer who had finally shown his true colors. The townsfolk swayed by Blackwood's influence, and the simple, ugly facts of the case believed him. Catherine found herself utterly alone, the sole defender of a man everyone else considered a murderer. The Richardsons, fearful of scandal, made it clear she was no longer welcome in their home. "It's for the best," Catherine Mrs. Richardson said, unable to meet her eyes. "We can't have our children associated with all this." She took a room at Mrs. Peterson's hotel, the same hotel where Zach had brought her when she had nothing. She paid for it with the last of her wages, her world once again shrinking to four walls and the crushing weight of uncertainty. Blackwood's men watched her constantly. They followed her when she went to the general store. They sat in the hotel lobby, their presence a constant silent threat. Blackwood wanted her, isolated, terrified, and helpless. He underestimated Catherine Morgan. Beneath her fear, a cold, hard anger was taking root. They had tried to break her spirit once before, and they had failed. She would not let them win. She knew Zach was innocent of Kane's murder, and she was the only one who could prove it. If they thought a proper lady from Boston couldn't fight, they were about to be sorely mistaken. She had one advantage: they didn't see her as a threat. She was just a woman, Zach's heartbroken lover. So she played the part. She kept to her room, appearing lost and defeated. But at night, when the town slept, she worked. Her mind, honed by logic and reason, sifted through the facts. Blackwood had to have an accomplice, someone inside the town's power structure. The frame-up was too perfect. Her suspicion fell on Deputy Miller, a weak-willed man known for his gambling debts. She began to watch him. She observed his routine, his trips to the saloon, the company he kept. One night she followed him out the back of the saloon and saw him meet with one of Blackwood's men in a dark alley. An envelope exchanged hands. It was the proof she needed, but it was not enough. A disgraced woman's word against a lawman's would be worthless. She needed to find Zach. He had told her of an old line shack in the high country, a place they used for shelter during winter roundups. It was a desperate gamble, but she had to try. Under the cover of a moonless night, she slipped out of the hotel, saddled a horse she'd purchased from the livery with the last of her money, and rode north, the small pistol Zach had given her a cold weight in her saddlebag. The ride was a nightmare. The unfamiliar country was treacherous in the dark, and every snapping twig, every hoot of an owl sent a jolt of fear through her. But the thought of Zach alone hunted, believing she had abandoned him, pushed her onward. She found the shack just before dawn, a dark shape nestled in a stand of aspens. Smoke curled faintly from the stone chimney. She dismounted, her heart pounding, and crept toward the door, pistol in hand. She pushed the door open. Zach sat at a small table cleaning his rifle. He looked up, and for a terrifying second, his eyes were those of a hunted animal, hard and dangerous. Then he recognized her, and the transformation was instantaneous. The tension drained from his face, replaced by a wave of disbelief and overwhelming relief. "Catherine." He breathed, crossing the small room in 2 strides and pulling her into his arms. He held her tightly, burying his face in her hair, his body trembling slightly. I thought I'd lost you too." "Never," she whispered into his chest, clinging to him. "They framed you, Zach. I know it. And I think I know how to prove it." In the safety of the small cabin with the wind whistling outside, she told him everything she had discovered, the deputy, the payoff, the relentless surveillance. They were no longer just reacting. They were planning. Her intelligence combined with his knowledge of the land and the men they were up against. A desperate, dangerous plan began to form, a final gambit to expose Blackwood and clear Zach's name. It would culminate in a confrontation, a final reckoning, in the heart of Silver Creek. The storm broke just as twilight bled across the sky, turning the world to shades of bruised purple and gray. Rain came down in sheets, lashing against the windows of the Silver Creek saloon, each gust of wind punctuated by a distant roll of thunder. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wet wool, cheap whiskey, and fear. Silas Blackwood sat at a corner table, a glass of brandy in his hand, looking perfectly calm. Across from him, Sheriff Thorne and Deputy Miller looked anything but. They were surrounded by a half-dozen of Blackwood's hired guns. The arrangement is simple. Sheriff Blackwood set his voice a silken thread in the tense quiet. You and your capable deputy will lead a posse into the northern canyons at dawn. You will find Hayes. There will be a regrettable exchange of gunfire. He will be brought back dead. The reward will be paid, and this unfortunate business will be concluded. Before Thorne could answer, the saloon doors swung open. Catherine Morgan stood there drenched and defiant, her face pale but her eyes blazing. "It's over, Silas," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that cut through the room's low murmur. Blackwood smiled, a cold, predatory curving of his lips. "My dear Miss Morgan, how brave of you to join us. But I'm afraid you are mistaken. It is just beginning. You hired Deputy Miller to plant the evidence." Catherine stated, her gaze unwavering. "You paid his gambling debts in exchange for his loyalty." Miller flinched, his face turning ashen. "That's a lie." "Is it?" From her coat, Catherine pulled a small leather-bound ledger. "This is the saloon owner's private book. It details all the credit extended to his patrons. Your debts, Deputy, were marked paid in full 2 days ago by a draft from a San Francisco bank. The same bank Mr. Blackwood uses." The saloon owner, a portly man named Sullivan, nodded grimly from behind the bar. "It's true, Sheriff. She showed me. I wasn't going to be part of a frame-up." At that moment, the back door of the saloon creaked open. Zachary Hayes stepped inside his slicker, dripping onto the floorboards, his face set like granite. His Colt was in his hand, held low and steady. Blackwood's men tensed hands, moving toward their guns. "Don't," Zach's voice was a low growl. "It's not them I'm here for. It's him." Blackwood rose slowly, his charming mask finally falling away, completely revealing the raw, festering wound of hatred beneath. "So the righteous Lieutenant Hayes comes to dispense justice. How fitting." He gestured to the men around him. "Kill him." Thunder cracked directly overhead, shaking the building. In that instant, Blackwood revealed his final terrible twist. "Do you want to know the truth about that day, Hayes?" "The whole truth," he sneered, his voice rising above the storm. "The intelligence wasn't flawed. My father was helping the guerrillas. He was a patriot. He gave them food and shelter. But my mother and my sister, they were innocent. They had nothing to do with it. My father begged your commander to let them go. He offered to surrender himself if they would let his family walk away." Zach stared at him, the color draining from his face as a buried memory clawed its way to the surface. He remembered the parley, the desperate farmer's plea. "Your commander refused." Silas spat his words like venom. "He said they were all traitors. He told you to burn the barn. But you were the one who suggested burning the house too. You said it would send a message." "I heard it all, you see. I was hiding in the woods watching." "You didn't just make a mistake, Hayes. You made a choice." The revelation struck Zach with the force of a physical blow. It was true. In the heat and fear of the moment, wanting to prove himself, wanting to end the bloodshed, he had made that suggestion. It wasn't just a tragedy. It was a sin. His sin. The confession shattered his composure. For a heartbeat, his gun hand wavered. And that was the opening Silas had been waiting for. He lunged not for a gun, but for Catherine, grabbing her and pulling her in front of him, as a shield, a knife appearing in his hand, its blade pressed against her throat. "Drop it." "Hayes," Silas screamed, his eyes wild. "Or she dies like they did." Zach froze, his face a canvas of agony. He was trapped, his past and present colliding in one impossible choice. But Silas had made the same mistake everyone else had. He had underestimated Catherine. While his attention was on Zach, she drove her elbow back hard into his ribs. The blow was precise and vicious. Silas grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She twisted away from him, dropping to the floor. The room erupted. Zach fired not at Silas, but at the chandelier above him. The heavy iron fixture crashed down, showering the room in sparks and glass, creating a moment of chaos. In that moment, Sheriff Thorne finally acted. His gun roared, and one of Blackwood's men went down. The saloon became a whirlwind of smoke and thunderous explosions. Zach moved through it all, his focus absolute. He saw only Silas, who was scrambling toward the back door, his escape route. Zach tackled him, and they crashed through the door into the muddy alley, the cold rain extinguishing the last of Silas's polished veneer. They fought with a primal fury, not with guns, but with fists and feet, their battle a raw, desperate struggle in the mud and the dark. It wasn't about land or money. It was about two lives destroyed by a single terrible moment 12 years before. Finally, it was over. Zach stood over Silas's bruised and defeated form, just as Sheriff Thorne and his deputies emerged into the alley. Zach's name was clear. The fight was won. But as he looked at Silas Redfield, a broken man weeping in the mud, Zach felt no victory, only the profound, aching weight of a debt that could never truly be repaid. In the days that followed, the storm passed, leaving the air clean and the earth raw and exposed. The truth, like the rain, washed through Silver Creek, laying bare the town's secrets. Deputy Miller confessed everything. Silas Blackwood was taken away in chains by a federal marshal, his fortune impounded, his reign of terror over. But the other truth, Zach's truth, remained. The story of the Redfield farm spread through town, whispered in the general store and the church pews. He was no longer the simple, heroic rancher. He was a man with a dark past, a man who had made a terrible choice. Some folks looked away when he passed. Others met his gaze with a new somber respect for the burdens he carried. Zach did not hide from it. He did not make excuses. When Mr. Abernathy, the county clerk, whose brother had died fighting for the Union, asked him about it directly, Zach answered with brutal honesty. "I was young, and I was wrong," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "And I've spent every day since trying to be a better man than the boy I was then." He and Catherine retreated to the Double H, to the quiet solitude of the ranch. The world felt different now, stripped of its easy certainties. They sat on the porch one evening, the silence between them no longer one of simple comfort, but of deep, shared processing. "He was right," Zach said, his voice rough as he stared out at the horizon. "What he said in the saloon. I made a choice. It wasn't just a mistake." Catherine reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. "You were a boy in a war, Zach. War makes monsters of boys. The man you are now. The man who rescued me, who showed me kindness when I had nothing, who fought to protect this place. That is who you are. The past doesn't define you. Your actions since then do." He turned to look at her, his eyes filled with a raw vulnerability she had never seen before. "How can you even look at me knowing what I did?" "I look at you, and I see the man I love," she said, her voice unwavering. "A good man who has carried a terrible burden. You don't have to carry it alone anymore." He pulled her into his arms, holding her, as if she were the only thing anchoring him to the world. Their relationship, which had been forged in conflict and tempered by danger, was now being rebuilt on a new foundation, one not of shared ideals, but of shared flaws and unconditional acceptance. It was stronger, deeper, and more real than anything either of them had ever known. Months passed. Autumn painted the aspens in strokes of brilliant gold, and the first dusting of snow capped the distant mountains. Life on the Double H found a new rhythm, a quiet routine of hard work and healing. Zach's actions spoke louder than any words of apology. He helped a neighboring rancher rebuild a barn that had burned down, worked tirelessly to restore the town's trust, and treated every person he met with a quiet humility that slowly, surely earned back their respect. The ranch began to thrive again. One crisp, clear evening, as the setting sun cast long shadows across the porch, Zach came to sit beside Catherine. In his hand, he held two small objects. "Sheriff Thorne gave me a box of Blackwood's personal effects," he said. "I found this inside." He opened his hand. Lying in his palm was her mother's silver locket, tarnished but intact. Catherine gasped, tears springing to her eyes as she took it. She clicked it open. The serene, smiling face of her mother looked up at her, a ghost from a life that felt a world away. It was a piece of her past, miraculously returned. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "There's something else," he said softly. He opened his other hand. In it lay a small, tattered photograph, its corners softened with age. It showed a young man and woman with tired but kind eyes, standing beside a small, rough-looking boy with a stubborn set to his jaw. "My family," Zach said, his voice barely a whisper. "We were tenant farmers in Tennessee. They died of fever the year before the war started. This is all I have left of them." He placed the photograph gently into her free hand. It was an offering of staggering trust, a final complete act of vulnerability. He was giving her the last locked room of his heart, sharing the loss that had defined him long before the war had ever scarred him. Catherine looked from the locket in one hand to the photograph in the other. Her past and his. The two halves of their story brought together by violence and circumstance, now joined by love and truth. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart full. They looked out at the vast, peaceful expanse of their land and the first stars beginning to appear in the deep purple sky. Their future was not built on a perfect, unblemished past, but on the hard-won strength of two survivors who had found in each other not just a safe harbor, but a home.